he seemed like a very strong candidate. He was on top of his dossier. He was surfing on really high public opinion polls relative to where he's been, and he was presidential. He gave a speech that was for policy wonks. It was a speech that really outlined a program. He avoided culture wars. He avoided a lot of the kinds of politics which might make the buzz on the internet, and as a result, a Sirius channel is going to do a report on the policies that he performed.
Some of his opponents have talked about, of course, the context of this campaign, quite extraordinary with the war in Ukraine, and some already said that it's overshadowing, almost stealing this campaign and questioning almost the legitimacy of this election in this context, which seems quite dangerous, actually. What do you think of that? Is that potentially a concern for Emmanuel Macron if he is re-elected?
Well, if the war were to turn bad, it could be a problem, but otherwise, he seems to be reaping the fruit of what's called the rally round the flag syndrome. And we've seen this before. France, like the United States, has a phenomenon when there's a war or a security issue. Public opinion shows greater support for the French president. And so it's an ideal time for him to launch. Thursday was the last day he could have announced his candidacy. And here, after 3 weeks of war in Ukraine, he was able to benefit. He's polling about 31% right now, which in another country might be terrible polls, but here it places him way ahead of the pack. If the war were to go bad, if somehow his leadership were to be put in question, he might suffer. But short of that, this is really a surprise rent for his campaign.
And he tried to move away from the question of the war and really tried to focus on domestic. I mean, he announced further spending in defense, but then tried to move on other reforms, and particularly talked about the pension reform. We know that was very controversial in his first mandate when he tried to introduce it, and then the pandemic hit and they kind of stopped this effort. We know there was a lot of social unrest in the first half of his first mandate because of some of these reforms. Is that potentially a risk for him, again, if he tries to reintroduce some of these reforms?
Yeah, when you look through all of the things he was promising, this one is the most dangerous politically, and where he differentiates himself from all the other candidates except Pécresse. He's asking to move the retirement up to 65 years, which probably for viewers in England or the United States doesn't seem very long, but it's a big deal here. And many of the groups that wield influence, unions, teachers, public workers, the highly organized members, the corporate members of French society are strongly opposed to touching it, all the retirement. And he's plugging ahead with it. This is dangerous. As he said, if COVID hadn't happened, he would have gone ahead with the reform. He was very unpopular at that moment, and this reform in particular will bring people out into the streets. But I believe the reason he's doing it is he wants to pay for $50 billion a year in new expenditures. And much of what he was able to announce were caramels that he would be passing out to different groups, like the nuclear industry or the defense industry or the universities or unemployed people.
And it seems one of the big concerns of French voters is purchasing power. And he didn't talk about it too much yesterday. I mean, he talked about how he wants to carry on reviving the French economy and the reforms to do that. We know that unemployment has gone down massively under Macron. He wants to reach zero unemployment in 5 years, which it seems very ambitious. But we're surprised about not focusing more on the purchasing power. It seems to be a key concern here.
Well, it's just terrible news for him. The gasoline prices are at record high, and it's really hitting people hard at the pump. Food prices are skyrocketing, and there's nothing he can do about it. There's nothing he can do because the war in Ukraine is cutting off gas and oil from the world markets, and the United States government had created an inflationary spiral. And so he doesn't control his money. In the past, when I moved here, France had a franc. It could have